Hello. You guys ready for chapter 3 of A Drop of Mercy? Let's get right into it. Mom cried when she heard the news. Oh, Abram, do you suppose they'll arrest the Quakers in Germantown too? And what about the Mennonites? Will they come for us? She pulled her chair closer to the parlor fire, as if to find comfort in its warmth. There's no explaining what men will do when hate muddles their minds, Dottie answered. But we've done nothing to them. Why should they hate us at all? It's a blindness, I think. Weren't we warned that the time would come when men would call good bad and bad good? But how could anyone think it wrong to want to be kind? The devil's been twisting man's thinking like this from the beginning, calling disobedience wisdom and forbidden things needful. It didn't take long for Cain to think it was a good idea to kill his brother. Will says some of the fellows are taken to the woods, Heinrich said. Dottie nodded. So I've heard. The Kolbs have gone for sure anyhow, and Rittenhouses are thinking about it. Maybe they're not so worried about the oath as about the conscriptors. Every one of those Kolb boys can hit a partridge at 50 yards. Alarmed, Heinrich asked, Do you really think they'd make us fight? No one can make someone fight if he doesn't want to. But they can strap a musket to his back and make him march with it. And you young fellas aren't technically considered non-associators. Not until you're baptized anyway. To them, you're as free for the musters as any man in Pennsylvania. Heinrich shivered. Do you think I should hide out too? I could go to one of the caves down by the creek. I think you're safe for now. If things heat up, though, we might send you out to Uncle Samuel's. We'll see. As cannon thunder boomed increasingly closer in the days that followed, Heinrich grew pensive. He even spied columns of smoke on the western horizon, dense black smoke. More and more people knocked on Mom's door, mostly refugees heading north. Panicked women and children fleeing Philadelphia to find their exiled men, Quaker, Brethren, and Mennonite families escaping from outlying farms, wounded soldiers limping on improvised crutches or pushed in wheelbarrows by comrades barely able to walk themselves. All of them were hungry. So Mom ripped the bread into ever smaller chunks and mixed a bit of water into the cider. On September 23rd, the express rider brought unsettling news. General Howe's army had forded the Schuylkill unhindered and was camped in Norrington, only 10 miles to the west of Germantown. I'd like to join the night watch, Heinrich said at supper one evening. Dottie set down his knife. Night watch? The fire brigade needs men to keep watch over the streets at night, Heinrich said, in case the soldiers start fires like they did in New York. What would you do? Watch things burn before the rest of the brigade got there? They've got water buckets filled on every corner and fire poles hung every 25 feet. If someone spots a fire early enough, he might be able to put it out before it spreads. Mom put her hand on her husband's arm. That might be a good idea, Abram. If our neighbors see us doing something useful, they might stop thinking we don't want to help. Dottie nodded reluctantly. I'd feel better if you had a partner. Perhaps Will Jensen or one of the other young fellows would be interested in joining you. Heinrich grinned. Will's the one who mentioned it to me. Heinrich rubbed his arms to stave off the chill. The night wasn't cold enough for a greatcoat, but the dew had found its way beneath his waistcoat all the same. Should have worn our shoes, he said to Will, walking barefoot beside him. And wear them out on a jaunt up the road? Heinrich glanced at the half-moon rising over the trees in the churchyard. Don't suppose she'll warm up things any. Not likely, Will said, but the light'll be nice. We can pretend it's the sun. Right. They were a comical pair. Heinrich, beefy as a prize bull and almost as heavy, while Will was a mere bantam of a fellow. Heinrich grinned, remembering the time they had tried to hitch themselves to the same yoke. He'd had to stoop practically to his knees, while Will stood on tiptoe till they both fell over laughing with the yoke stretched across their chests. They had been patrolling the few blocks from Heinrich's house to the Concord school since sunset, and Heinrich's enthusiasm had drained to drowsiness hours ago. Until the moon had risen, there had been little to break the monotony, just a couple of dogs hoping for a handout, and the light flickering upon the road from the slowly dying hearth fires in the houses they passed. Suddenly, Will cocked his head. Is someone coming? They turned to stare into the shadows that melted into the nothingness that was the southern half of town. Horses! The boys scurried into the lane between Jacob Kaiser's house and the Mennonite meeting house, where the moonlight had yet to reach. Will leaned close to Heinrich's ears. British! Heinrich nodded, too, by the sound of it. The heavy hoofbeats pounded rapidly, as if haste were more important than stealth. The boys pressed tightly against the irregular stone wall of the building. The riders sped by the lane without a glance. Whatever their errand, it was too urgent to take note of two unarmed lads in the shadows of Germantown. Those are thoroughbreds, Will whispered when the riders had passed, and fresh. And they weren't common soldiers, neither, Heinrich added. What do you suppose they're up to? I don't know. Think we should tell someone? Who, the fire brigade? Good point, Will said. I sure wouldn't mind knowing what they're up to, though. It woke me up, at least. We better make another round. The boys kept to the shadows as they walked another circuit in silence. North, along the east side of the road, crossing to the west side at the school, south along the west side, crossing at Heinrich's, then turning to trace the circuit again. When their hearts stopped pounding, and it became apparent that no other riders were coming up the road, Heinrich spoke, though more softly than normal. What do you think about this giving food to militia? You heard the elders. You agree with them? Don't you? Will said. It was more of a statement than a question. I think we should feed the poor, Heinrich said. So what's your problem? Mom gave food to a militiaman at our door the other day. And you think she shouldn't have. It was a waste of good food, if you ask me. He could have just taken what he wanted from the garden, Will countered. Heinrich grunted. Will continued. You shouldn't be so harsh, Hein. Why should it matter what a man thinks about soldiering if he's hungry? Now you sound like Justinia. Maybe you should listen to her. Heinrich changed the subject. You hear what happened at Paoli Tavern? British snuck up on some of them Continentals while they were sleeping and bayoneted them. In their sleep? The lucky ones. What do you mean? Some of the Continentals woke up and tried to surrender. Brits wouldn't take them. Killed every one of them. That's horrible. You're telling me. Will shook his head and they continued on in silence. Will suddenly grabbed Heinrich's arm and stopped him up short. You smell smoke? Heinrich lifted his head and squinted toward the house beside them. Probably just a bit of chimney smoke lying low under the dew. Will gestured to the lane beside the house. We better check it out. They opened the gate that led to the lane and quietly walked to the small kitchen building in the rear. No light came from the small outbuilding. Not likely to be any fire in there. They circled to the rear of the kitchen and saw, sure enough, a bit of smoldering shrubbery in the hedge beside the fence, though it hardly looked like the work of a saboteur. It must be an ember escaped from the chimney, Heinrich groaned. Shoes surely would come in handy right now. Throw some dirt on it, Will said, bending to grab a handful of dust from the edge of the lane. The sputtering flames extinguished almost immediately. Heinrich swept low in a bow before his friend. My compliments to you, sir. You have vanquished the enemy in a most auspicious manner. Will gave a lopsided grin and shook his head. You're hopeless. Heinrich drew the curtains tightly around his bed to shut out the morning and lay back on the pillows with a sigh. Finally. The clock in the parlor had read 7:30 when he came in. He could catch a good 6 hours and still be up in time to give his father a full afternoon's sleep. He closed his eyes and basked in the satisfaction of having done a good thing. The fire not have been started by vandals, but it was a fire all the same. And who knew how big it might have gotten before someone noticed it if he and Will hadn't been on the watch. His eyes flew open in confusion. Had he slept? He must have. Even the bed curtains didn't completely mask the midday sun. What time was it anyway? As he swung his legs over the side of the bed, Heinrich cocked his head. What was that noise? Sounded like 1,000 horses trotting by. He hopped over to the window, cracked the shutter, and peeked out. Just as he'd thought, thousands of horses and soldiers, British, marching down the road in perfect columns. Heinrich threw on the clothes he had dropped on the floor just a few hours before and ran into the hallway. The balcony door was open, and the rest of the family stood at the railing, staring down at the enemy flooding into their town. Dottie turned toward Heinrich with a grave look on his face. They've come, son. Time to see what we're made of. That ends chapter 3. Next week I'll read you chapter 4. I hope you have a really good week. See ya.